This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. Dr. Gautam Sen, formerly of the London School of Economics, joins me from London today to discuss something that's making headlines across India and indeed, of course, is always debated in other parts of the world, not least in the country that he lives in, England. Inheritance tax. What is inheritance tax? Does it really work anywhere? Does it work in England? Does it work in the States? Some of the states in the United States where it exists in some form or shape. To talk about all that, Gautam Sen. Gautam da, thanks very much for joining me.
My pleasure.
Talk to us a little bit about your opinion on the inheritance tax. You've had a long experience of seeing this in England. Does it work in India? Does it work in England? I'm sorry. And will it work in India?
I think it would be appropriate to start with a slightly broader background in order to contextualize the issue which has now arisen in India, accompanied by so much controversy. This whole idea of tax is part of the entire human project of redistributive justice. So it is not simply an issue to do with inheritance tax per se. It's part of a much larger picture. And indeed, it has biblical origins. Though actually, in reality, Christian states were unable really to implement redistribution in any serious way, virtually in its entire history. There were, of course, many spectacular cases of Roman noblemen giving up their entire fortune and their estates to the church. And indeed, by the 5th century, the church had become the wealthiest corporate body, in fact, far ahead of the nobility in the Roman Empire. In fact, people will perhaps be surprised to know that this is not surprising to a Hindu view of life either. In fact, the slogan of the World Hindu Economic Forum, of which I was one of the original founders, is that few produce, many consume. So this too is consistent with the Hindu view of life. And in fact, the only difference is the Hindu view does not embrace the idea of coercion. It hopes for a dharmic view of life in which individuals will voluntarily do their hard work and allow for sharing. Of course, the communists
quite like many Jain businessmen do. I mean, we recently saw one more instance in India of a Jain, multi-millionaire, maybe even a billionaire, essentially give up all his wealth. And there were incredible, videos of he and his wife throwing money on the roads and so on and so forth. So I understand what you're talking about.
Absolutely. And in fact, this did happen earlier in the history of India. And we should not be unduly alarmed by the idea of redistributive justice. It's only a question of how this might be done and what is pragmatically feasible. I would also hazard a guess that the communist inspiration for equality actually arose out of Christianity too, because really communism actually is a secular form of Christianity. But anyway, let me just quickly start with the Indian instance. I begin by saying it is simply infeasible to have a serious inheritance tax in India for pragmatic reasons. And let me explain why. About 2.5% of Indians pay personal income tax. So really, if you're going to talk about taxing anybody on their inheritance, it has to be this tax-paying group, which is a tiny, tiny proportion of the population. 77% of all the household wealth in India is held in real estate assets, which means basically their home. Another 7% is in gold and durables. So to have a serious redistributive inheritance tax policy, you have to take away their house. And you will have to put the families on the street. But the tragic part of this story is that even if you took away all their wealth, it would not make a difference to the lives of the 97.5%, because it would be too small in aggregate terms to change the lives of the enormous mass of people who are not personal taxpayers. So this actually is a very silly argument that let's tax everybody, let's survey how much money they got at home, because their money is basically their home. And we're talking about and I don't think even 2.5% of the population own their own homes, because out of this, a proportion are probably renting. What else do they have? They have, on average, 30,000 rupees in the bank. Of course, you could take that away. But that 30,000 rupees is really for emergencies like going to the doctor. So, we will have chaos. The other area where you could not impose inheritance tax, and that will then take away even a larger chunk of this 2.5% cohort,
That's
which pays.
agriculture, and that's agricultural land.
Exactly. You could not impose it in agriculture because the farmers will be on the gates of Delhi in 2 hours with their tractors from all over India, not just Punjab and Haryana and West UP. So agricultural tax will have to be exempted. Nobody will dare. And if you did try, production will fall. It will mean the breaking up of larger units, big time. What else will happen? If you simply try to take away people's homes, in anticipation, they will sell their homes and buy agricultural land. So the housing market will collapse, and agricultural land prices will go through the roof. Now, I wonder which government would wish to countenance this kind of chaos. Now, apart from all of this, the Indian economy would collapse. So now let's take the final group of people from whom you could grab a big chunk of money. This is the very rich. The Ambanis, the Adanis, the Mahindras, and the Tatas. Actually, you couldn't touch Tata more or less because they are mainly in a trust. In virtually every single country in the world, trusts are exempt. So Tata would probably escape, but you could probably target the Ambanis, Adanis, Mahindras, and Godrej, and many, many others. What would happen is already happening in India. You may have been reading over the past 2 years of millionaires fleeing India. Do you know where they're going? 70% of the people fleeing India are going to Dubai.
Dubai. Yes, they're all going to Dubai.
Because there's no personal income tax in Dubai. So all Mr. Ambani will do, he will re-register his company in UAE. If not Mr. Ambani, his children will certainly do that in the UAE. And he will only then be liable to corporate taxes. And all that wealth will flee India. Everybody will do that. And do you think the UAE will oppose this? We are hardly talking about 15, 25,000 very rich people. I would have thought less if you talk about people who own more than $10 billion worth. So they'll all run away to Dubai. Dubai will be absolutely delighted. You could say, oh, we'll raise corporate tax, punish them. That will lead to a further collapse of the economy because corporate tax is a competitive business. You have to keep in mind
collapse. If you raise corporate taxes like this, I mean, you know this better than anybody else, investment will immediately collapse.
Absolutely. And we already have that in India. If you regard electricity price as a form of taxation, that's why there's no industry in Punjab. So whoever wants to impose inheritance tax really needs to think about the detail. And I'm shocked that someone like the distinguished economist from Cornell hasn't thought this through and thinks it's a great moral argument. Yes, as I just said earlier, it is a great moral argument, but we have to be pragmatic. So the idea of inheritance tax is a non-starter in India, and especially because India is a poor country. We could have a token inheritance tax, but it will make no difference. This big story that we will make India egalitarian, the 50% you don't have will take from the 50%. This really, I mean, is not a serious proposition on any count. So let's rule out the idea that we can have it in India, even if it's the finest moral idea. If you say they all should behave like Jains, I'm rather sympathetic to this idea, that if we are all going to give away our wealth, and what does Dharma say? Dharma says 3 important things. Be selfless, be humble, and be courageous. And what does selfless mean? Selfless means, can you treat a stranger as if they're your family member? So you will give up your wealth for the stranger as you would for your family. Even the richest and meanest businessman in India will do all the sacrifice required for their own family. So he has to treat a stranger like the family. Now, if that dharma comes, fantastic. That's a goal towards which we should always strive, that we will give up much of our wealth for other people. But to impose it in this way as a policy is not going to work. So that's India. I hope you understand why it cannot happen. Now let me look at the United Kingdom.
Before we move on, I have 1 or 2 more questions about all that you said, Gautam. One of the things I want to ask you is the point you made about agricultural land. And the point you made about the very tiny number of people, the quote unquote Indian middle class, which actually pays tax. This is basically the salaried class. And all taxation in India is essentially directed as a punishment towards this class, sadly, so that more and more can be squeezed out of this class. Talk to us a little bit about what will happen if many of these people essentially shift whatever money they have into buying agricultural land? Because you know, and I know, no government in India has the authority or the audacity to touch agricultural land.
This actually is a fantastical idea because hypothetically, what they might do is give up the house they own, become renters, and invest their capital in agricultural land. But really, this is not practically feasible even for them to do. It's just incredibly disruptive. But 70%, 77% of everything they own is in real estate, which really means your home. Virtually every country in the world exempts your residential property from inheritance tax. In the UK, you are allowed to give away to your children and grandchildren, not to strangers, up to £500,000, that is about 5 crore worth of residential property to your descendants, direct descendants. In addition, each individual is allowed to keep £325,000 free of tax, which is 3.25 crores approximately, says 100 rupee exchange rate. So basically, 8.25 crores is exempt from tax. After that, you pay 40%. You can escape that if you give it away your property 7 years before you die. Or if you put it in a trust, which means you have no right to the property, but it's held in trust for your children or your grandchildren. Because the absolute nominal amount hasn't changed since 2010, the government's tax collection in the last 14 years has been rising. Because of inflation, property prices have risen, so a lot of people are paying tax, and the British government is basically bankrupt. So they are not changing the base amount, which was fixed in 2010. Now, logically, it should rise with inflation, but that hasn't happened. So that's England. Now, the example Sam Pitroda gave of the United States is worth looking at.
First of all, there is just one moment, but I want to ask you a question about England, because a lot of people, it has one of the oldest inheritance taxes, right, in the world. Let me ask you this, and I'm reading now from the official government website on inheritance tax. 27,000 estates, or 3.73% of all debts in the UK, paid inheritance tax in 2021. The tax raise was only $5.76 billion that year. There's more.
Pounds.
Billion pounds that year. There is more. Both the Labour government and a Conservative government have actually worked to mitigate the worst impact of this tax. In 2007, the Labour government introduced a transferable nil rate band between spouses and civil partners, allowing spouses to leave any unused portion of the nil rate band at their death to their partner. In 2015, the Conservative government introduced an additional nil rate band for transfers of a main residence to a direct descendant. This nil rate band was originally set at £100,000 and rose to £175,000 in 2020-2021. Tell us, it seems that essentially in the UK, government after government is trying to mitigate the impact of this tax. That suggests to me that perhaps this tax is not so popular and not so effective after all.
Very few people actually in the end pay inheritance tax in the UK, very few people, but it's immensely unpopular with the general population. When the Tories had announced in 2013 they were going to abolish it altogether, their popularity went through the roof. Even people who are not subject to the tax support this idea. Now, who pays the tax? Actually, the only prominent instances is people who have country mansions, old nobility, having to sell their paintings and other things in order to pay the tax. So many of the nobility have actually lost their homes, which go back to the 18th, 19th, and 17th century. So that has happened. At the moment, the inheritance tax level is about £7.5 billion. It's gone up by £2.5 billion since 2021 because, again, as I said, the band has not moved since 2010 with inflation. Now, the reason why all the parties were anxious to mitigate, as you have pointed out, is they did not want people to lose their homes on the death of their parents. Now, there is no tax between couples, by the way. If the wife inherits all the estate of her husband, she pays no tax on that. Only after she dies will the tax become payable. So there is no taxation between couples, married couples. If you're unmarried, then only your portion is tax-free. So this question of preventing distress to the family has been uppermost. That's why nobody's going to challenge this. But in the United States, it's much more interesting because that's the one which people have been saying, and I think Sam Pitroda said inheritance tax. Actually, inheritance tax exists in only about 4 or 5 states in the United States.
That's right.
Kentucky, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and a few others. There is
And I
no
will point
federal.
out here that not one of those states is in fact renowned for the productivity or enterprise in the US.
No, because if you are in the United States and a state has inheritance tax, you just move to the neighboring state, just across the border. So inheritance tax in one part of the United States is of no use, but the United States has something similar. Though I would have thought Mr. Pitroda would know what it's called. It's the estate and gifts tax. And I've just been looking at the data. In 2022, it was paid by 4,000 people. Just 4,000 people. And the amount of tax was 0.6% of total revenue. That is, it was 27 billion in 2022, whereas the US government's total revenue was $4.44 trillion. So it is $4.44 trillion versus 27 billion pounds, which makes 0.6%. So there is actually no serious taxation. Much of it escapes because of trusts. People create trusts, so they don't pay. So there isn't really any serious inheritance tax, as Mr. Pitroda would have us believe. Now, let's think about just 3 other countries at random. Korea and Japan have high inheritance taxes. Particularly, Japan has inheritance tax up to 55%, which is the number Mr. Pitroda quoted wrongly for the United States, because in the United States it's between 18 and 40% estates and gift tax, 18 and 40%. In Japan, it starts at 15% and rises to 55%, depending on the level of income. But the first $450,000 is exempt. And for each offspring, a further, I think, $56,000 is exempt. So quite a large amount of inheritance is exempt from taxes. And how many people do you think pay inheritance tax in Japan? 4%, which is very tiny considering Japan is a very prosperous country. A very similar situation prevails in Korea. The biggest single episode of inheritance tax payment is occurring right now. The owners of Samsung are having to pay $10 billion. So that is, in a way, the exception that proves the rule, that very few ordinary people pay tax. Now, let's take the much more interesting case of Sweden. Sweden is a high tax country, right? One of the highest tax countries in the world. I think the aggregate GDP tax ratio is over 50%. I think 52 or 54%. That's high. Even in Europe, it is 38 to 40.
Which is very controversial. IKEA only doesn't live in Sweden.
No, but the Swedish case is the most interesting. It has 52%. But actually, the Swedish tax is, in my view, a very legitimate tax. I would support that 50% tax because you don't have to pay for private education as you do in England or India.
That's right.
It is such a policy. So you save a ton of money by sending this your children to state schools without having to shell out lakhs and lakhs of rupees. In England, it costs £60,000, 60 lakhs a year to go to Eton. So all of the money in Sweden you save because you send them to state schools, which is the case in most of Europe, France, Germany, because state education is very good quality. So high tax but good education. Same is true of quality of healthcare. Quality of healthcare and other public services is so great, you don't spend very much money privately. So this high level of tax is supported by the Swedish people because they know they're actually better off than people in low tax countries. Sweden had an inheritance tax. Not a significant one, but it had one. Tetra Pak, which is the biggest Swedish company, the biggest one, he migrated, he left Sweden. He went
No,
away.
it's same thing. I mean, I just mentioned IKEA. All these examples are there.
They went away. Sweden has abolished inheritance tax. So there is no inheritance tax. And now Sweden tax revenue has gone up. Why? Because more investment has come back to Sweden, more employment is occurring, so more personal taxes are being collected because people are not spending huge amounts of time and effort to escape inheritance tax. One of the reasons Sweden abolished inheritance tax was actually a very humane reason. Many Swedes have a little country home out in the mountains or wherever. And a lot of Swedes are suffering distress, having to sell those homes and sometimes their own homes, which is what would happen in India. So that is why Sweden abolished the inheritance tax, and they're finding that total tax revenues and the welfare of the average Swedish person, the so-called people who are not so well off, has gone up as a result. Now, the Sweden example is a salutary one and should be examined with great care. My great worry, if I may come back to India, is that really you won't be able to take away the homes of the Indian middle class, because that's what it amounts to. I can't see any government daring to do that. This is the one time the middle class, which doesn't bother to go out to vote in the heat, will be out in the streets. Because they will have to be in the streets because they'll have no home. So they will be out in the streets, and this time they'll be throwing bricks. So you can't do that. You can't tax agricultural land. The best you can do is to take away the 30,000 rupees on average they have. And as for the gold being seized by going to the homes, that is 7% of their total wealth. And you really will have to take the Mangal Sutra away, because the Mangal Sutra might constitute 1/7 of that.
So,
So,
and can you really imagine? I mean, Gautam, that, imagine a scenario. I would like to understand which government in India will go to people's homes and from the gold that the lady of the family often treasures, will take that gold away from those families. I mean, who's going to do it? It's just impossible. It's fantastical. It's as fantastical as people selling their homes and going and buying agricultural land. This is just not going to happen.
No, but the administrative task of doing this and doing it on a regular basis, because you'll have to reevaluate the wealth in order to take it away from them. This, I mean, it's a nightmare scenario. Even if it was a very good idea, it could not be implemented. And as I said, they're very rich. We'll all become Dubai citizens. And this is why the government has already changed our immigration rules. I don't know if you're aware, you could stay in India for 180 days before last year without having to pay tax on your global income. So these guys would go to Dubai, pay no tax, and come back to India for 180 days and run their businesses. That has been reduced to 90 days now. So you can only come back to India for 90 days. And 91 days, you have to pay tax on your global income. So going to Dubai will not work. I know people individually who have not earned any money in India, their only money earned abroad, have a wife and children in India. They can't come and visit very often anymore, though they're not generating income in India. So this is happening. It will get 100 times worse. So I don't understand why anybody is proposing this, or indeed why anybody is worried about this, because it will collapse immediately as they try to implement. I would like to add something else which might seem a little bit political.
Further, I also want to add one more question, if I may. As we come to the end of this conversation, apart from the point that you're about to make, I also want to ask you a little bit about legacy. Because, you mentioned the home so many times in this conversation. In India, that one home that you have, or even if you make a little bit of money, there is a real sense of legacy being passed on from generation to generation. There is a sentimental value to that legacy. There is a emotional value to that legacy. Talk to us a little bit about that. This seems to be targeting that idea of legacy.
You know, I'm tempted to say this is all about economics in the end. The legacy derives from the fact is that after a lifetime of working, middle class people have managed to buy a home. So all their emotions are invested in this home because that's all they managed to acquire after 30, 40 years of working on relatively modest incomes that they managed to buy a house. Ask any Indian, मैंने घर खरीद लिया. Look at the people who receive free homes or money to build their homes from the government. They are so happy. They feel ये सारी छोटा जमीन मेरा है. This is the only thing I have on this earth, which I have never had. And in India, you see, very few people had their own homes even 30 years ago. We were a poor country. Now, a substantial portion of the relatively poorly off lower middle class have started acquiring very modest homes. Go to any city, you will see 3, 4 people sleeping in a 2 bedroom flat. And they are so happy because they say, this is mine, maine banaya. So, how are you going to take it away from them? Who will have the heart? Which government inspector will come and throw their belongings out in the street? कौन करने वाला है? Because you are paying income tax and you are a little bit better off than other people. This is simply not a realistic or humane idea. But humane is an issue which we should deal with. We can abuse the government for many things. Fine, I won't contest this. But this government, the first time in hundreds of years, has provided 70% of the people of India with piped water in their homes. If you have water in your homes, you don't know what a big deal it is to have water in your home. Stopped. So a lot of people have piped one tap, and for them, that's a very big change. They have toilets in their homes. Maybe not perfectly implemented, but this is again a huge change. They don't have to cook on chulas with wood, which kill your lungs. It really makes you ill. They can, if they want to, buy a underpriced gas cylinder. You can go to the hospital and have 5 lakhs paid for your treatment. A relative of mine last year, middle class relative, said she was going to have an operation. Could I send her some money? Which I did. And she wrote to me later, operation carried out successfully. He said, the 5 lakhs paid for everything. I've saved the money you sent me. She was delighted. I was delighted to hear that. So, these are very big changes. These are welfare changes. These are things which can be measured in the Human Development Index. It changes people's life. We cannot keep talking about cash income alone. This government has absolutely done the right thing by giving people goods and also making sure it reaches them by putting the money in their bank accounts. And the government is saying this is just the beginning. Everybody will have a pakka house, I think, by 2026. I'm a slightly old man now, as you can see, but it takes my breath away and fills me with happiness because I am from Calcutta. And whatever else we do, we believe in people having a more equal life. In all these years, that's the one thing that hasn't changed in my view of the world, that we need more equality. And this equality cannot come from just handing out cash, because handing out cash is not an adequate way. You have to give the poorest people things which are taken for granted by everybody else. And this government has done a huge job. Nobody has done this in India or any poor country. Please don't take this away, and as a result, curse them for things which are unjust. You can abuse them for many things, but this achievement is a spectacular one. And look at the growth figures now. Highest growth rates have happened in the last 5-7 years in the poorest parts of India. The data Shamika Ravi has beautifully illustrated on YouTube that I've seen shows that. In addition, the biggest growth in consumption is happening in rural India. If you look at the sales of durables. So poorer parts of India and poorer rural India is doing well. We are not going to get to the goal in 2 years, 3 years, but in 10 years, We will be proud that the poor of our country are better taken care of. We will never be a rich country. We are not going to be $15,000 per capita anytime soon. But it doesn't bring me any embarrassment to say, for this, I do Shashtang Pranam to our Prime Minister. He has been the driving force. This is the credit of Narendra Modi. And every time people abuse him, including some friends of mine, I am absolutely dismayed. He has delivered big time. And I would say that despite the fact that I'm not going to be able to vote sitting here in England. So on that note, let us say, be realistic, and we are all in this big leaky boat. And we can argue, we can fight, but remember, we are all in the same leaky boat and we have to cooperate. We have to look out for each other. And the only road of doing that is to have a modicum of dharmic sentiment in our souls, which means not even hating our enemies.
On that wonderful note, Dr. Gautam Sen, thanks very much for your perspective and your time. Thank you very much for explaining to us in great detail with examples from England, from Sweden, from the United States, and elsewhere, why inheritance tax is such a bad idea, indeed, is an unimplementable idea in India. Thanks, Dr. Sen.
Namaskar. Thank you, Hindol. Thank you.